working member. He never has to check in.
Josh, I'm back. Does that sound or look any better?
Yeah, I've got you. You still sound fine.
morning, the Senate Finance Committee will examine issues of racial justice and tax code inequality in America. Nobody of good conscience wants there to be a race-based penalty or a discount on taxes. Everybody ought to pay their fair share, and everybody ought to have a fair chance to get ahead. In practice, the US tax code doesn't always work that way. If America's busted old tax code excels at anything, it's rewarding those who are fortunate enough to already have wealth. The lucky few with the top incomes can go years deferring their taxes, paying what they want when they want to. On the other hand, there is no deferral for a Black nurse who pays taxes out of every paycheck, or a Latina small business owner who pays taxes quarterly. According to a recent survey, a typical white American family has 8 times the wealth of a typical Black American family. Some of the cornerstone tax policies in America include well-intentioned tax incentives for home ownership, education, and retirement savings. Those incentives only really work for people who can afford to buy homes and set aside money for education and retirement. Those people are much likelier to be white. The committee is going to hear a lot more examples like those today, illustrating how the tax code adds to inequality in America. The fact is, some recent changes have made the situation worse. An estimated 80% of the individual benefits of the Trump tax law went to white Americans. Even the benefits that went only to the top 1% of taxpayers were skewed the same way. The American Rescue Plan enacted in March begins to change the math of racial injustice and tax code inequality. It expanded the earned income tax credit for millions of working people. It expanded the child tax credit and made sure millions more working families will receive the full amount available. Too often, families and individual workers with lower incomes, particularly Black and Latino, haven't had access to those full benefits. Those expansions are going to be game changers for workers and families in Oregon and across the land. They ought to be permanent, and I am working with members of this committee to make that happen. Now, inequality isn't just about race. It's about gender. Women business owners, particularly women of color, are underrepresented, undercapitalized, and underappreciated. The share of business revenues that go to women-owned businesses hasn't budged in 20 years. It's stuck now at 4%. Along with Senator Cortez Masto and Senator Hassan, Senator Cardin and I are introducing the Progress Act that's going to help boost that figure. Our bill is all about promoting investment in women and minority-owned businesses and helping them to grow and to hire more workers. Finally, family policymakers need better confidential data on how tax laws affect Americans of different races. Other federal agencies collect that type of demographic information, and policymakers can use it to improve them. The IRS does not. The fact is, the tax code isn't strictly about government funding. Congress decided long ago to use the tax code to tackle major social and economic challenges. The words Black or white or Asian or Latino or Native American don't have to appear anywhere in the tax code for tax laws to affect those groups differently. Too often, those differences are adding to inequality. Now, the IRS needs to meet a higher standard of confidentiality due to its history and the sensitive nature of taxpayer information. That said, it makes no sense to blind lawmakers to the key data that would illuminate just injustice in our tax laws. It is time for more tax data transparency. This committee is going to make sure that happens in a manner that fully protects the privacy and confidentiality of each American's taxpayer information. I'm looking forward to discussing those issues and more today. There's lots to cover. I want to thank our witnesses, Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And welcome to our witnesses. I look forward to hearing your experiences, thoughts, and ideas today. There are questions of whether the tax code by itself leads to differing impacts across race, gender, age, or geography, or whether it's the underlying income, wealth, asset holding, or job type disparities that principally cause these differing results. Underlying disparities are key, and it is important to know about them. There are a variety of disparities in measures of income, wealth, and assets across many dimensions. Examining the disparities using statistics shows a variety of results along with changes in results over time. The Pew Research Center, for example, recently identified that income inequality for Asian Americans rose to become the highest among racial and ethnic groups. Underlying causes of these disparities are not entirely clear, since causality is difficult to establish. As a result, there are different views. Some views focus on government policies, while others stress inequities in opportunities for education and asset building, along with changing patterns of family formation and institutions like marriage. Today, our witnesses will provide perspectives on the income tax system barriers to opportunity, policy solutions, and issues that we should consider, along with economics. Prior to the pandemic, the United States was experiencing one of the strongest economies across demographics in decades. With the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in place, an agenda focused on smart regulation, we saw progress among many dimensions, including record low unemployment rates for African Americans, Hispanics, and others, 50-year lows in overall unemployment, robust wage gains, skewed toward lower wage earners, record high household incomes, and record low poverty. The TCJA included a number of provisions to make the personal income tax system more progressive, addressing these inequalities, including doubling the child tax credit, nearly doubling the standard deduction, and features such as opportunity zones to inject more financial capital into distressed communities. It will be interesting and increasingly challenging to return to an economy as robust as we saw before the pandemic, with the endless streams of tax hikes and regulation that the current administration continues to propose. Going the opposite direction of combating inequality in the tax code are efforts like trying to roll back the cap placed by the TCJA on state and local tax, or the SALT deduction. I expect some of the proposals we will hear about today will have promise, and others may not actually get to the root of the problems we are addressing. I'm eager to hear more. Whatever we consider, it will be important that the policies are developed on a bipartisan basis. No one party has a monopoly on good ideas, and any work on persistent barriers to opportunity will ultimately fail if done in a partisan fashion. I look forward to our hearing today, Mr. Chairman, and thank you.
Thank you, Senator Crapo, and I look forward to working with you and our colleagues on these issues. Now I'd like to introduce our four witnesses. Professor Dorothy Brown is a professor of law at Emory University School of Law, where she teaches tax. She is a nationally recognized scholar in the areas of race, class, and tax policy. Mr. Mihir Desai is an economist and professor of finance at Harvard Business School and a professor of law at Harvard Law School. Our next witness, Ms. Himalaya Rao, is the managing director of Black Founders Matter Fund and is a fellow Oregonian. Our final witness is Mr. Shay Hawkins, president and CEO of the Opportunity Funds Association. Mr. Hawkins previously served on the Finance Committee as the staff director for the Subcommittee on Energy, Natural Resources, and Infrastructure, of course, with our colleague, Senator Tim Scott. Thank you all for coming. As is customary, your prepared statements will automatically be made part of the record. Please use your 5 minutes to summarize. Please proceed, Professor Brown.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share these views on how our tax system perpetuates racial inequality. In my testimony today, I will draw upon research in my book, The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It. I plan to discuss 3 tax policies that are more likely to provide tax breaks for white Americans than Black Americans when they engage in the same activity. But if there is one thing that I hope you remember from my testimony today, it is that racial inequality is baked into how our tax laws operate, not because the Internal Revenue Code has separate rate schedules by race, but because American taxpayers bring our racial identities onto our tax returns. That not only harms most Black taxpayers, but inevitably some white taxpayers as well. Understanding how this racial disparity happens is difficult because the Internal Revenue Service does not publish statistics by race. I have had to become a detective of sorts. Another piece to unraveling the racial disparity is understanding the role of history. Many of our current tax provisions date back to a time when separate but equal was the law of the land. I begin with the joint return that entered the code in 1948. The joint return gives a tax cut to marriages where one spouse earns roughly all of the income while the other spouse works in the home. Census Bureau data I analyzed show that white married couples are more likely to be found in single wage earner households than Black married couples. That means when white Americans marry, they are more likely to get a tax cut, but not Black Americans. Married Black Americans are more likely to be found in 2 equal wage earner households and do not get a tax cut. In many instances, the joint return has led to married Black couples paying higher taxes. And there has always been a percentage of married white couples who also need 2 incomes to make ends meet. My solution is a return to individual filing and a repeal of the joint return. The second provision is the exclusion of gain on the sale of homes for up to $500,000 if you're married and $250,000 if the taxpayer is single. The tax treatment for gain dates back to 1951. Losses on the sale of homes, on the other hand, are not deductible. Research shows us that the greatest appreciation in our homes comes when we live in neighborhoods which are overwhelmingly white with very few Black neighbors. As the percentage of Black homeowners in the neighborhood increases, the value of the homes decrease. Most white homeowners live in mostly white neighborhoods, while most Black homeowners live in racially diverse or all Black neighborhoods. As a result, white homeowners, but not most Black homeowners, are more likely to sell their homes at a large tax-free gain. Research also shows that the homeowners most likely to sell their homes at a non-deductible loss are Black. Tax subsidies for homeownership create white tax winners and Black tax losers. The federal government should stop subsidizing a racist homeownership market. The final area I want to highlight is the tax break for employer-provided retirement accounts. The tax break traces its roots to 1942. Amounts set aside in retirement accounts by employees, and if there's an employer match, amounts set aside by their employer are not taxable to the employee until their expected withdrawal at retirement. If any amounts are withdrawn prior to the age of 59 and a half, they are subject to an additional tax penalty. Black Americans are less likely than white Americans to work for employers that provide retirement accounts. And further, Black workers, regardless of income, are more likely than all other racial and ethnic groups to take an early withdrawal and pay a tax penalty. Given that less than half of white workers, a little over a third of Black workers, and a quarter of Hispanic workers in the private sector participate in their retirement accounts, tax subsidies should be withheld until the private sector increases their employee participation rates. In The Whiteness of Wealth, I discuss many other areas where federal tax policies disadvantage Black Americans, but they all lead to the conclusion that our tax laws need a fundamental overhaul that places racial equity at the center. I look forward to your questions.
Here in a few minutes. Our next panel member will be Professor Mihir Desai, an economist and professor at Harvard Law School. Sir, welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in these hearings. I want to use this opportunity to make 5 points that are elaborated in my written testimony. There's a staggeringly persistent and large correlation between race and income, savings, wealth, and mobility. Addressing these correlations should constitute a central ambition for all policymakers. The tax system, in an effort to isolate the ability to pay, employs income and the returns to wealth to raise revenue in an efficient manner. The returns to wealth are often granted preferential treatment relative to labor income in order to encourage certain behaviors or to offset the lock-in effect associated with the realization-based system. Looking at certain preferences in isolation will yield the conclusion that these preferences have a disparate impact on racial subgroups. This statement, as far as it goes, is incontrovertible. Indeed, it is unsurprising when one considers the correlations discussed already. The remaining 3 issues raised by this result are far less straightforward. Specifically, is this analysis complete? What should we take away from this analysis? And might such an analysis lead us astray? The result that specific provisions, when considered in isolation, impact racial subgroups differentially is a qualified one and can be highly incomplete when handled loosely. In particular, when analyzing the intersection of tax policy and racial justice, 3 errors should be avoided. The first issue is that analysis of tax policy should trace through the incidence of benefits or taxes beyond the claimants of any particular benefit. The ultimate beneficiaries of tax policies are rarely only nominal claimants. I provide an example in my testimony of the LIHTC, an important provision that would yield nonsensical results if analyzed in the manner described above. The second issue is that revenue neutrality is an important discipline on tax analysis. Isolating a preference that benefits a subgroup is not enough to assert that it should be repealed because that preference exists in a larger system that requires financing. The discipline of revenue neutrality can yield counterintuitive results. My testimony provides an example of how the repeal of the mortgage interest deduction could result in a less rather than more progressive system. The third issue is that the broader tax system must be considered in examining the impact on racial subgroups. Given the correlations of wealth and race identified above, it is not surprising that preferences for the returns to wealth may have a disparate impact on racial subgroups. It would also not be surprising if progressive income tax rates and refundable tax credits would also have a disparate impact on racial subgroups in a distinct direction. Said another way, it is critical to consider the totality of the tax system if one is to assess the racial impacts of the system. Given data I provide on the progressivity of the tax system, it would be unwise to extrapolate from an analysis of savings preferences to the whole tax system. Tax analyses that consider race can also go astray. When seeking solutions to these problems, analysts have dismissed tax credits and progressivity in support of radical solutions, including blowing up the tax code and starting from scratch. These claims can be self-defeating for the cause of racial justice because they underemphasize the role of current provisions in advancing the agenda of racial justice. The real promise of this hearing and of an increased emphasis on race, ethnicity, and gender is to reorient our policy debate away from its current obsession with inequality broadly and toward a sharper focus on those in our country in deep need. Over the last 20 years, academic studies that claim sharply rising levels of income and wealth inequality have become accepted as fact and undergird much policy discussion today. Related studies claim that the tax system does little to address inequality and that novel instruments are required to address these issues. These studies and the obsession with rising inequality are problematic for many analytic reasons that cast their results in doubt. Moreover, they are problematic because they orient attention to the very rich and away from the other parts of the income distribution, particularly the bottom quintiles of income distributions. It is curious that many of these efforts don't mention or measure the earned income tax credit in their discussions of economic justice, despite its role as a critical anti-poverty program. In this sense, the broader inequality debate obscures the readily available solutions for racial and economic justice, the EITC and more progressive rate structures, and focuses our attention incorrectly on issues of corporate taxation, the possibility of wealth taxation, greater middle-class tax relief, and broad-based entitlements. Expanding the EITC in 2 directions, with a refundable minimum credit and with a larger childless EITC, would be enormously beneficial to the causes of economic, racial, and gender justice. Over time, providing more income to those at the bottom of the income distribution will allow them to begin saving and building wealth. Reparations would seem best suited to address the question of the racial wealth gap. It is worthwhile noting that comparable efforts at reparations, including those for Japanese Americans, payments to Holocaust survivors, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and local American efforts, such as those in Rosewood, Florida, did not employ the tax system. That is, I believe the reparations debate should be initiated in earnest and could address the racial wealth gap in interesting ways, but there's no clear, obvious reason to operate it through the tax system. The true payoff of this hearing will be if the underlying correlation of race with income, wealth, savings, and mobility regains its status as a question of central importance to the future of the country. I very much hope you all find the courage and wisdom to address these questions as directly as one can in the tax code and otherwise.
Professor, thank you very much. And wisdom is certainly in need on Capitol Hill right now, and we thank you for being here. Our next witness is Ms. Himalaya Rao, one of my neighbors in Portland, and we're so glad that you're here, Ms. Rao, and please proceed.
Thank you so much, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you today. My name is Himalaya Rao, and I'm the Managing Director of the Black Founders Matter Fund, which is a venture capital firm based out of Portland, Oregon, investing in Black entrepreneurs throughout the United States. We're an early stage fund, which means we invest right alongside or right after angel groups, which is really early in a founder's journey. They may have some initial traction like an MVP or some initial customer validation, but we are really the ones who are giving them both the capital and the resources to be able to grow and scale their businesses. As you might notice, I don't look like who would be the typical face of someone in venture capital. There are very few women in this space and even fewer women of color. I'm also a first-generation immigrant to this country, and my career actually started out in the Bronx as a school social worker working with children and families, so very far from venture capital. No one in my immediate family has actually gone into business, so I went to get my MBA so that I could learn the language and how to navigate this space effectively. And it was there in my MBA program that I first was introduced to entrepreneurship and venture capital. And to me, venture capital is the perfect merge between social work and business, because every single day I get to be part of the redistribution of wealth from very wealthy individuals to founders on the ground who are working tirelessly to create new and innovative solutions to small and systemic problems. When I started out my career, I positioned myself as a venture capital consultant, and in the first few years had the opportunity to work across 7 different funds. This gave me a unique vantage point to be able to see how different firms operate in this space. It also made me realize that even when there's a huge amount of willingness to invest in diverse founders, there's significant barriers to actually achieving that outcome, which for the most part haven't changed in the last 10 years. And so as I reflected on what those challenges are, I deduced it down to 3 central issues that I've elaborated in my testimony and I'll present to you today. The first is that investors engage in a pattern matching behavior to evaluate startups. So what that means is that we utilize our past experiences to determine the propensity for if a founder or a venture has the ability to be successful. And that's an entirely normal way for humans to process information, but it really poses a threat to equity in this space. And that's because historically, venture capital and entrepreneurship has only been an option for a small subset of wealthy white men. So if you think about it like an algorithm, all the inputs we're using to determine what success looks like is based on an incomplete data set that's also not representative of the types of ventures or founders that are present today in the United States. The second issue is that we also engage in homogeneous groupthink. Oftentimes in this space, there are a lot of initiatives to try and promote demographic diversity. And while that is absolutely critical and foundational to creating representation in this space, we also often overlook the absolute necessity to include people with different values, different socioeconomic statuses, and education to create a true environment where there are people with different lived experiences, and therefore the inclusion of people who have different ideas about what success can look like. And the final issue is that there's not currently enough on-ramps for different types of individuals to become investors and participate in this space. I've laid out several key recommendations in my written testimony, like tax incentives, investor re-education, student loan credits, and changes to legislation on who can participate in this space. I encourage the committee to consider ways in which we can support the greater participation along 3 stakeholders, and that would be BIPOC founders, BIPOC emerging fund managers, and BIPOC investors, to be able to then create a better environment where investors and fund managers like myself can be better representatives of founders and Americans at large. We all have implicit bias in our decision-making process, but if we can create a broader sense and a broader level of representation and participation in this space, we can actually start to create a more equitable space where all founders have equal access to capital and growth. Thank you again for giving me this platform to advocate for founders and the inclusion of diverse and BIPOC founders. As a first-generation immigrant, I believe that our differences are what make us and this country continue to stand at the forefront of innovation. I'm honored to be part of that solution, and I invite any questions you might have. Thank you.
Ms. Rao, thank you very much for excellent testimony. I also want to note at this point, you're highlighting the shortcomings of algorithms in some of these issues is critically important. I am the sponsor, along with Congresswoman Clark and my colleague, Senator Booker, of the Algorithm Accountability Act. So we're going to want to follow up with you on your important points there. Our final witness is an alum of the Senate Finance Committee, Mr. Shea Hawkins, formerly with our colleague, Mr. Scott. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee. It is a pleasure for me to be with you today. This is my third time testifying before Congress, but my first time testifying before the Senate. So I thank you for having me. I am the co-founder and president of the Opportunity Funds Association, and this morning, I would like to share a few success stories from opportunity zones. I'd like to discuss ways to build wealth through expanded retirement saving. I would like to remind the committee of the ways tax reform made the tax code more equal. And finally, I'd like to suggest a couple policies to get investment capital into the hands of minority entrepreneurs. Prior to co-founding OFA, I served as tax counsel to Senator Scott, where I helped him champion opportunity zones. And in opportunity zones, we are seeing wealth being built through diverse projects and diverse leaders. Quinn Palomino was born in Vietnam right at the end of the Vietnam War. She grew up in refugee camps that the U.S. had set up in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. Today, Quinn leads Virtual Partners, a global private equity firm that was active in social impact prior to opportunity zones, but has raised $100 million across 4 opportunity funds to build a combination of commercial, real estate, and affordable housing nationwide. 2 weeks ago, I was in Panama City, Florida, where George Gonzalez of the St. Joe Company broke ground on a waterfront hotel and standalone restaurant on the Panama City Marina. This project will create 150 direct jobs for current residents and rebuild a portion of Panama City that was completely devastated during Hurricane Michael. Alex Bethal, managing partner of RevOZ, a leading real estate investment firm specializing in opportunity zones, will cut the ribbon on an 11,000 square foot office project. This facility will house San Bernardino County's Children's Department of Behavioral Health, providing mental wellness care to some of the most vulnerable and underserved members of that community. We can also build wealth through retirement savings. According to the Federal Reserve, the bottom 50% of American families hold less than 2% of total US wealth and have a median retirement savings balance of 0. This committee did great work towards helping to mitigate that when this committee developed the Secure Act. Another promising way to address this challenge was outlined in a recent paper from the Economic Innovation Group by a bipartisan pair of economists, Teresa Ghilarducci and Kevin Hassett. The authors propose a new program modeled after the highly successful thrift savings plan. This would be aimed specifically at helping lower income workers build wealth and retirement security. And if it were properly designed, a program like this could go a long way towards narrowing the racial wealth gap. And finally, Congress should do no harm. In tax reform, we placed the cap on the state and local tax deduction. We doubled the child tax credit. We doubled the standard deduction. And we put a limitation on the home mortgage interest deduction. And so particularly, when we're looking at the state and local tax deduction, we should not lift that cap. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently called SALT a gift to billionaires. And I can't say that I agree with the representative often, but on this issue, the math is on her side. And uncapping SALT is a non-starter for those concerned with income inequality in the tax code. I also look forward to discussing ways that we can use the tax code to draw money into the hands of minority entrepreneurs, and I will address that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Let me begin, if I might, with you, Professor Brown. Let's see where you are. Professor Brown, very good. Your testimony makes clear that by giving tax breaks to those who are already wealthy, the tax code perpetuates long-standing inequality. Seems to me it's even worse than that. A Black family with the exact same pay stubs as a white family is less likely to own stock than the white family. Can you briefly describe your research with respect to stock ownership by Black households and how that plays into their ability to benefit from the capital gains tax rate?
So research shows that Black Americans, pretty much regardless of income or wealth, are less likely to own stock than white Americans. In fact, there was a study of the top 5% of Black wealthy Americans, and it showed they were less likely to have stock than white Americans. And the benefit of owning stock in the current tax code is taxes are much lower. So if I had a choice, I'd rather have my wages taxed at the low preferential rate that currently is what stocks are taxed at. So because Black Americans are less likely to own stock, we're less likely to take advantage of that tax break.
Now, it seems to be compounded by the fact that billionaires don't need to sell their capital assets. They can avoid paying any tax with all of the deferral loopholes in the tax code. Now, does the ability to defer taxes on capital assets, sometimes indefinitely, add to the racial wealth gap in your view?
Absolutely, because what a wealthy parent can do is buy stock, have it appreciate significantly, don't sell it. When they die, they leave it to their child as an inheritance, and their child gets it tax-free with a stepped-up basis, which means something that those on the committee, but people hearing may not know. So let's say my parent, well, not my parent, let's say a white parent bought stock at $10,000, and when they die, the stock is worth $100,000. Their child inherits the stock, $100,000 tax-free. The next day, the child sells the stock for $100,000. They have no taxable income because our tax laws give them a $100,000 basis equal to the fair market value. So that taxable gain will never be taxed by anyone. So yes, wealth is transmitted through gifts and inheritances, and white Americans are more likely to receive that than Black Americans.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brown. Let me turn to my Oregon neighbor, Ms. Rao, if I might. We're interested in your highlighting what you consider to be the top challenges for minority and female entrepreneurs in obtaining capital. And we're introducing some legislation today that is going to begin to speak to this, but I'd be interested in what you think the top challenges are to getting capital.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. So some of the top challenges that I noticed in my career in venture capital is that even when there are platforms for Black and Brown founders to be able to pitch their ideas, there's a lack of representation on the investor side to be able to understand and articulate the strengths of those individuals who are pitching. And so early in my career, what I started to do was to be the translator between those Black and Brown founders and investors. And so investors are looking at a specific set of criteria in order to consider a company investable. And what I would do is to be able to formulate the ideas of Black and Brown founders in a way that captures what investors are looking for. And I believe that with greater representation of different lived experiences on the investor side, that there will also be a greater propensity towards seeing what different models of success can look like, and thereby increasing capital access to Black and Brown founders.
Now, today, several of my colleagues, Senator Cortez Mastow, Senator Hassan, Senator Cardin, and I will be introducing 2 new tax incentives designed to flow benefits into the hands of minority and female business owners. The first is a tax credit for hiring the first employee, an incentive to hire that person. And the second is an investment credit to encourage investments in the smallest of the small businesses, those owned by individuals earning less than $100,000 per year. In your view, would these credits help with the challenges that you're describing for women and minority-owned businesses?
Thank you, Senator. I absolutely agree that the 2 proposals that you mentioned will help to funnel in capital, and more importantly, will help to increase the participation of different types of investors to be able to funnel in money into different types of businesses. Oftentimes, that representation is overlooked, and I do think that both your proposals for the first employee credit as well as the investor credit will help to incentivize participation.
Well, thank you, Ms. Rao. My time is up, but we're really appreciative of having an important Oregon voice on this. We know we've got a lot of heavy lifting to do in this area, and we look forward to working with you and all of our very good witnesses today. It is now Senator Crapo's turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to go first to you, Professor Desai. We've heard a lot lately about income and wealth inequality, and it's a very critical issue. Some have recently claimed that the federal tax system may have become regressive, despite longstanding and overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In fact, even progressive economist and former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers commented recently on some of the recent analysis, saying that it is, quote, substantially inaccurate and substantially misleading. A question that I have for you is, we've heard today that there is inequality caused by the joint filing allowed for people who are married, by the mortgage interest deduction for people who own homes, and for those who are investing in their retirement savings. So we've got marriage, home ownership, and retirement savings as the target for changes in the tax code. If those changes were made, if those deductions were disallowed and removed, I understand that that would cause those who are married and those who own homes and those who have retirement savings to pay more taxes. But would it reduce the burden on those who do not, on those who are truly at the lower income quartile and don't have as much access to home ownership and retirement savings?
Thanks, Senator Crapo. So yes, first, I think on this industry of folks who are suggesting that the tax system is regressive and has become less progressive over time, I provide evidence in my testimony that suggests that's just wrong. And I think it's very problematic. You know, it's problematic because it shifts attention away from where we should be thinking about it. It makes us think that we can solve our problems by taxing billionaires and by supposedly getting hundreds of billions of dollars that are in offshore tax havens, neither of which I think is true. And it's distracting to the plight of people in the bottom 2 quintiles. It's very important for wealthy Americans and corporations to pay their fair share, but fundamentally, I think this is distracting. And in that process, we lose sight of the instruments that will actually help us and help the folks who we really, I think, want to try to help in the bottom 2 quintiles. To your question about the specifics on marriage and home ownership and retirement accounts, you're exactly right to say that perhaps narrowly this could help in some way. But in the context of the overall tax system, one has to ask, well, where would those revenues go? How would they be used? To who would benefit from them? And maybe more importantly, it doesn't really address the underlying problem, which was, I think, in the colloquy between Senator Wyden and Himalaya, about building wealth at the lower end of the income and wealth distribution. That, I think, is a much more interesting discussion than the discussion of looking at particular preferences on savings and suggesting they have a disparate impact on racial subgroups.
Well, thank you. And I agree with you. And my next question will be directed at you, Mr. Hawkins. But before I give it, I say, I really think we ought to be focusing on things like strengthening and enhancing the EITC, strengthening and enhancing opportunity zones, strengthening our access to retirement savings so that people can get into the business of putting some money away for retirement savings. And Senator Warner and I worked on a piece of the capital access in the last one of the last bills where we help to give significant expansion to our community development financial institutions and encouraging and incentivizing access to capital being growing in those areas. Those are the kinds of solutions it seems to me that we should look at. Mr. Hawkins, my question for you is, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did a number of things to simplify and increase progressivity of the personal income tax system. And I'm going to just list a few. Doubling the standard deduction, expanding the child tax credit, expanding the alternative minimum tax exemption, enacting opportunity zone incentives, capping the SALT deduction, capping the mortgage interest deduction, and limiting the exclusion for employer-provided fringe benefits. Do you agree with the Joint Committee on Taxation analysis showing that the TCJA made the personal side of the income tax code more progressive? And do you think that any of the list of provisions I just identified, including the cap on the SALT deduction, should be rolled back? We can't hear you.
It's it's clear. I do agree with the Joint Committee on Taxation. It did make the tax code more progressive, and none of those items that you mentioned should be rolled back. Particularly the SALT cap. I mean that is objectively oriented towards the absolute 1%. And should absolutely not be repealed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Members to ask questions, we have our colleague Senator Stabenow and then Senator Scott. Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everyone for really important testimony today. This is such an important topic, and I just want to set out, it's interesting to me that when we discuss tax policy, and just as an editorial comment, that our colleagues, our friends on the other side of the aisle, view tax policy, tax cuts really as a primary solution to so many issues. But when we talk about this one in tax policy, it's not viewed as a part of the solution, which I find interesting. As chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee last year at the beginning of the pandemic, after the first couple of months, I released a report on the disparities, the impact on the pandemic on minority communities, on healthcare, which was obvious, and housing and small business, and who our essential workers were. But we didn't really focus on tax policy, which is why I think this is such an important discussion. And I wonder if Professor Brown, if you would want to talk any more about the tax code and your efforts and seemingly neutral terms and items that actually create disparities. I know you've spoken about this, but in the context of the last questioning on whether or not this the tax code is important to address, if you might just say a few words about that.
Thank you so much. And yes, I think it's important that we focus racially disparate impact of our tax laws. And I don't think it's enough to say you can't do it in isolation, because my argument is we shouldn't do it in isolation. We should look at everything. And what's really important is my research shows this isn't a function of class. It isn't that only Black Americans pay more taxes because we are disproportionately poor. It is Black Americans at all income levels. If you want to talk about wealth building, who is better able to build wealth? Those with higher income. But our tax laws disadvantage Black Americans at all income levels when we are doing the same thing our white colleagues do. So I think it's important to talk about race and taxes, and I applaud the committee for this hearing.
Thank you so much. And also, I would throw this question, Professor Brown, to you as well, but also Dr. Desai. Recently, President Biden signed an executive order creating a cross-agency group with a mandate, as you know, to address systemic racism in the U.S. government, which would include gathering data to track the effects of policies on disadvantaged groups. And although the government analyzes discrimination again in lending and housing and employment and so on, it generally does not focus on tax policies. And so what challenges do you and other researchers face in studying the effects on tax policies on households and businesses, and what steps should Congress take to ensure on the front end that tax policies do not enforce or exacerbate income and wealth disparities?
So it's you know, as I said in my testimony, I've had to become a detective of sorts, because I couldn't go to the statistics of income at the IRS and see which taxpayers paid, you know, which exemption. So it's been really hard. It's taken me a couple of decades. I'm glad I'm on the other side of it, and I hope going forward that it changes. So yes, there's the executive order that put together a data group, but we have to see what fruit that bears. I think Congress going forward could make a point of putting together a racial impact statement, for example, for any proposed tax provision, to see how we would expect it to impact Americans by their racial identities.
Thank you. Dr. Desai?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think, you know, Professor Brown has done decades of research on this, and it has been difficult. I think the issue today is about collection of data and analysis of data. So the first thing on the analysis of data is we actually know many things from her research and many other researchers about disparate holdings of wealth, about income levels, that one could use to make this analysis happen. So I'm not sure there's a need for additional collection of data. Second thing, I just think it's worth, again, saying that we would want to think about the totality of the tax system in doing that analysis. And then finally, I would say my big concern would be kind of the politicization of the analysis that's done by the JPT and others, which is so valuable for tax policy. And in particular, many provisions, I give the example of the low-income housing tax credit, which would be very, very difficult to analyze the racial impact of, and are going to require really heroic assumptions, and the collection of additional data won't necessarily help with that. So I think this is an incredibly important agenda, but to me, I think a lot of data is in place to do what we need if we want to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My colleague for her good questions, and I think Professor Brown, what you're saying is it's time for a bit more tax transparency and make it a little bit easier for those in the detective business. And thank you for your important points. Our next colleague will be Senator Scott. Is Senator Scott here? Okay, our next colleague will be Senator Cantwell, followed by Senator Thune. All right, next we have Senator Carper and then Senator Toomey. Senator Carper?
Mr. Chairman, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, and hello to all of our witnesses, and thank you very much for joining us to today. I asked my staff when I was governor of Delaware from 93 to 2001, and what we focused on for those 8 years, among other things, we focused on how do we strengthen the basic building block of our families, and that's what we did for 8 years. And we created something called the Family Services Cabinet Council. We started literally from birth, and we. I think we made great progress. The current governor of Delaware has picked up the Family Services Cabinet Council. He used to be a member of my cabinet, and we still have a Family Services Cabinet Council, 7 government, 8 departments with state government that all work together to help families, help improve the life of kids and families. One of the things that I've always focused on, as my colleagues, some of my colleagues know, is root causes, not just the symptoms of problems, but root causes. And I asked my staff to dig up some information, looking at the number of children that are living in single parent homes in our country, to do that by race, and also to analyze what the percentage of families are led by solo parents. It's pretty interesting information. So when we think about root causes. And I don't think we're focusing as much on root causes as maybe we could or should. Out of all solo parents, the 42% of those are led by a Caucasian. 42% of the families with solo parents are Caucasian. 28% are Black, 24% are Asian, and 3% are Hispanic. And there's a different way to ask the same question. And the question is something like this. With respect to percentages of children who live in single parent homes by race, I'll say it again, percentage of children in single parent homes by race, 15% are Asian, 15% are Asian, 24% are Caucasian, 42% are Hispanic or Latino, 42%, 64% are African American. And I think those sets of data are worth our consideration as we focus on not just the symptoms of problems and how to deal with those, but as we think about root causes. I also asked my staff to help me actually analyze the ways we try to help lower income families, if they're Latino, white, Black, Native Americans, whatever, and the ways that we're trying to help incent work and to help in capital formation. And among the programs that we were looking at were earned income tax credit, which has been discussed here, hugely important. Retirement programs that actually allow people who have very low incomes to sign up almost from day one when they start their employment, the kind of stuff they do in Oregon, as the chairman knows, and very good program out there. Opportunity zones, CHIP program, Children's Health Insurance Program, tax breaks for innocent marriage, child care funding, and we're doing a whole lot of that actually through the ARP. Student debt repayment assistance, the Affordable Care Act, the tax credits in the Affordable Care Act, the money that we're providing for food banks across the country through all of our COVID packages. WIC, the WIC program, Women, Infant, Children, SNAP. It used to be food stamps, now it's SNAP. Medicare Part D, drug assistance for folks in Medicare. Medicaid expansion, I think we used to be down about 70%. Now we're up to like 130% for Medicaid expansion states. Child tax credit, which we've expanded in the most recent package. GI Bill. When I was coming home from the Southeast Asia and enrolled in a business school at University of Delaware, GI Bill was about $250 a month. Today, the GI Bill provides tuition free and housing allowance for GIs anywhere from and their families from $1,000 to $2,000 a month. Delaware Tech in my state, we have a seed program. Anybody who graduates, I think, with a C+ or more from Delaware High School can go to Delaware Tech tuition free for 2 years. And Delaware State University, which is a 3rd ranked HBCU in America, out of all the public HBCUs, Delaware State University is ranked number 3. They have a scholarship program. I think it's worth about $4,000 a year in tuition assistance. The minority of folks who receive that are students of color. I mentioned those things just for a little bit of background to put this in context as we think not just about the symptoms or problems and how we deal with those. I want to come back to opportunity zones and just to ask our friend, our last witness, to just go back and just tell us again what more can we do to improve and better target in opportunity zones so that they actually do help minority families. Go ahead, and minority businesses, please.
Well, thank you, Senator. One thing that we can do to help target opportunity zones to minority businesses is there's 3 levels of benefit associated with opportunity zones. And one level is to allow for a 100% step up in basis on the capital gains on the business that was started within an opportunity zone. And so for the purposes of that benefit, we can allow non-capital gains to be invested. If folks want to hold an investment for 10 years plus, and then move forward and sell that business, then they will be able to sell that business capital gains tax free. In the original Investing in Opportunity Act, the legislation which Opportunity Zones is based off of, that was a feature. And for scoring purposes, it was difficult to put it in tax reform. However, allowing non-capital gains to be invested long-term for 10 years plus with a 100% step up in basis, if that business is sold, would bring a lot more capital into opportunity zones and a lot more into the hands of minority entrepreneurs who are less likely to have access to investors with capital gains tax liability.
We're gonna have to move on, Senator Carper. But I know our next questioner, Senator Scott, will probably be interested in the very question you have been talking about. So we'll continue this dialogue.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to Senator Carper for making it easy for me to transition into my questioning on opportunity zones of Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Hawkins, I was going to ask you a question about opportunity zones later on during the process here, but let's just continue the conversation that Senator Carper was so gracious to begin. I'll say without any question that you look at the commitment, the dollar amount committed from the private sector to some of the most distressed communities in our country through the opportunity zone legislation. It's over $70 billion, from my understanding. Is that about right, sir?
That's about right. What you've seen is about $15 billion that's been committed to opportunity funds, the actual vehicles that make the investments. And then that money is then levered up when it's invested into the actual opportunity zones, sometimes 2, 3, 4 to 1.
Excellent. And would you also agree, Mr. Hawkins, that opportunity zones, while one of the more important aspects of the legislation is to bring private capital into distressed communities, another very important feature is not to gentrify those neighborhoods. And thus far, we've seen in the single digits gentrification. Is that still accurate?
That's still accurate. So about 2 to 3% of the designated opportunity zones, the census tracts that were eligible for this type of investment, were on an opportunity zone trend prior to being designated as opportunity zones. And so we've seen that gentrification so far in the designated zones is no more severe than it was on the trend that existed prior to being designated.
And that's incredibly important because I've said this several times, that the definition of creating better communities is to run people like me out. As a person who grew up in poverty in a single parent household, if the definition of improving a neighborhood is to push me out, that does not work for me. So I'm very pleased and excited to hear that opportunity zones continue to produce more opportunities for typically majority minority areas in a way that doesn't necessarily lead to gentrification.
Absolutely.
And
one of the key things that we need in order to maintain that trend is we need, I would love to see you reintroduce your Impact Act, which provides us reporting and transparency for what's happening in opportunity zones. And so that way we will understand the direct jobs that are created, and the economic impact on the communities that have been designated. And you all will have the tools to make any adjustments to opportunity zones that are necessary to make sure that the existing residents of opportunity zones benefit.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Hawkins, for that last comment, because it's really important for us to be able to measure the success of the zones. And one of the ways that we do that is by having reporting requirements that require all funds to report on their activity. And that kind of information will help us understand if we're actually helping the community or if we're only helping investors, because my goal is to help the community first, and by default, let investors benefit from doing good and making a decent, not a great, but a decent ROI. Finally, Mr. Hawkins, as you know and I know, but others may not know, you served as my tax counsel during the tax reform. And I am thankful that you helped us write that tax bill. And frankly, I'm happy to report that doubling the child tax credit, that working on lowering the small business burden by 20%, lowering the corporate tax from 35 to 21. All those features have had a tremendous impact on lowering unemployment, closing the income gap, closing the wealth gap. And frankly, I saw reported that the lowest level of poverty in the country's history since they started tabulating it in the 1950s was 2019 or so, pre-pandemic.
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. And you look at the different aspects. One of the things I always joked about when I was working for you is I loved having a boss that had actually in his past career signed the front of a check, not just the back. And so I thought so much about how the 20% reduction in the pass-through rate would have benefited you when you were at Allstate, and that those businesses that you passed on to other minority entrepreneurs will benefit from that pass-through deduction. So there's so much that was done in that bill that benefits minority entrepreneurs and that makes our tax code more fair. I'm very proud of the work I was able to help you with.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your timeliness there of having Senator Carper go right before me so that we could continue the conversation on opportunity zones. That's pretty good leadership. Thank you, Mr. Hawkins.
I wasn't able to foreordain it, but I'm glad that members are getting recognized. The next two will be Senator Toomey and Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. I hope that there is a universal acknowledgement that there has never been, and certainly in the tax reform we did, any pernicious racial intent in the sense of trying to benefit a given group at the expense of another. Such a suggestion would be untrue and frankly offensive. The idea behind the tax reform, which is, the dominant discussion about the tax code as it is today, one of the central ideas, there were several, but one of the central ideas was to lower the after-tax cost of deploying capital, with the notion that if we did that, we'd get an increase in the deployment of capital. That would help improve productivity, because really capital is the tool that's necessary for workers to become more productive. And that would enhance the economy overall, but especially for middle and lower income workers who would benefit from that. And that, of course, is exactly what happened. I think it's very, very important to underscore that it was almost immediately after we passed the tax reform that we had the best economy of my lifetime. Now, you might think that's just a big coincidence. I don't think so. I think it worked exactly as we had hoped. The capital investment did, in fact, create a boom. Workers became more productive. And Mr. Hawkins, I don't know how closely you've looked at this data, but if you have, could you comment on the acceleration of wages, which reached an extraordinary level just before the pandemic hit in 2019, and the wage gains that were strongest for the lowest income workers? In fact, isn't it true that since wages were growing fastest for low income workers, we were narrowing the income gap, we were narrowing the racial disparities in income, by virtue of the powerful economic growth we had.
Absolutely. And so we saw wage growth. I mean, that wage growth is a direct result of a tightening labor market. When you have record unemployment rates for Asians, for Hispanics, for African Americans, for women, when you have these record unemployment rates, it tightens the labor markets, and employers have no choice but to pay more to draw people to their firms.
Right.
And we were pleased to see that a disproportionate amount of the benefit of those wage gains came at the lower end of the income spectrum.
Right. So I would just suggest, and I wish I wish this weren't controversial, but I would suggest we try to get back to the best economy of my lifetime. I would suggest we try to get back to record low unemployment. I would suggest we try to get back to narrowing the income gap. Those are really good things, and we were there just a little over 1 year ago. But if we unwind the pro-growth features in our tax reform, we're not going to get back to those days. And instead, actually, one of the central ideas that some of our Democratic colleagues have is to do something that is the exact opposite of helping low-income workers, but eliminating or dramatically lifting the SALT cap. The deduction for state and local taxes of $10,000, that's already a lot. You know, if you have $10,000 in state and local taxes, you probably have more than the median income in the United States. If you get rid of that cap entirely, the benefit flows overwhelmingly, massively to the top 1%. It's a big subsidy for working Americans to the richest Americans. Mr. Hawkins, do you see it differently, or is that what lifting the cap on the SALT tax would do?
It's exactly what it would do, and that's how I see it. That's how the Brookings Institute sees it. They noted that if the cap was lifted, almost 90%, 96% of the benefit of the SALT cap repeal would go to the top quintile. 57% would go to the top 1%, and 25% would benefit the top 0.1%. And those people in that category would get a tax cut of nearly $145,000. And so there's no intellectually honest argument to raise the SALT cap if your goal is to is to eliminate income inequality in the tax code.
No, it certainly makes it worse. And finally, let me just point out, it's not only in how it affects people, but it's the nature of the deduction, right? This is an arbitrary subsidy for people who choose to live in high tax jurisdictions. That's what it is. In those jurisdictions, you often get more services. You choose to pay for those services. I don't know whether it's trash removal or whatever else it might be. You pay for it in the form of a property tax very often, where constituents in a place that doesn't have as high a tax, they just have to contract separately. When they contract separately for those services, they don't get to deduct that payment. But if you increase the SALT tax deduction, they can. So I think I've consumed most of my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Ron, you're on mute. Second.
I got you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank all of our witnesses. And I particularly want to thank you for your leadership in regards to dealing with the inequities in our tax code. There are two aspects to this. Professor Brown, I appreciated your analysis of the discriminatory nature of the tax code itself as it relates to many of the provisions, but it's compounded by the challenges we've had on discretionary domestic spending, where we have not been able to move forward on a lot of important issues, and we use the tax code as an effort to try to make up for those inequities. I want to just share with you a meeting that I had with the Industrial Area Foundation. That's our build organizations locally talking about affordable housing and economic development and the challenges we have today. And I pointed to the fact that yes, I would like to do things on the discretionary spending side, but we also need to recognize that we have tools available under the tax code, and we need to make those tools even more effective. We've talked about the opportunity zones, but I want to mention the new market tax credits that I partnered with Senator Blunt to make permanent. That's been very helpful in Baltimore, and I can mention many of the areas of revitalization, including Remington Way, that would not have been possible without the new market tax credits. I could mention the historic tax credits that have been very helpful, and we're trying to improve the historic tax credits. I want to thank Senator Portman. We're working together on the Neighborhood Home Investment Act, a new effort to deal with the appraisal gaps in low-income communities in efforts to renovate their home, the housing stock in low-income communities. These are all areas of effort to try to improve the effectiveness of these tools. The point that was brought up to me by the Build organization is one that there is not one tool available that can make a renovation of a community available or feasible under the tax code. They have to put together so many of the different tools and private sector development, et cetera. So, Professor Brown, I'd just like to give you an opportunity to talk about how we can improve the tax code in dealing with the housing crisis we have in America by fine-tuning the tools that are currently available, including the low-income housing tax credit that Senator Cantwell has been so actively engaged with, in order to try to deal with inequities through the tools available in our tax code.
So I will say that when we subsidize an activity, whether it's homeownership or whether it's affordable housing, we have to think about who we're going to help and who we're going to hurt, right? So the problem with affordable housing transcends the code in this sense. There are zoning requirements that are anti-affordable housing. There are developers who want a certain return on their investment and are reluctant to invest in those neighborhoods. And if you want to encourage that, I don't know if the best way is through the code or direct spending. So if you want to also talk about increasing homeownership rates among low-income Americans, one of the biggest barriers to homeownership with respect to Black Americans is a down payment. And there's nothing the code can do to provide a down payment. Direct spending could, but nothing in the code. So there's often a mismatch between the goal that you want, which is to spur investment in distressed communities, and the chosen means, which is opportunity zones, which tend to benefit wealthy white developers as opposed to the members of the community.
And I agree with you, but if you look at the trend over the last several decades, you've seen a larger amount of public support for affordable housing under the tax code increasing, whereas under direct spending, it's been reduced. I certainly don't want to reduce the tools we have available under the tax code. I would like to increase the opportunities under direct spending. That's not always politically possible. So I think we have to look at what is reality. I want to cover one additional point, if I might, and that's the paid preparers. I mentioned that at our last hearing, but low-income families are the ones being victimized the most under changes in the tax code, particularly the earned income tax credit. And we have, as you know, no regulatory power right now under IRS to regulate paid preparers. And I think it's in the interest of low-income communities, a consumer interest, that we give that power back to the IRS. I don't know, Professor Brown, if you want to comment on that or not.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a start, but really the big problem is the complicated nature of the earned income tax credit. So the community of earned income tax credit recipients has a higher percentage who use paid tax return preparers than the rest of the population. That's because the EITC is just too complicated, and Congress could take some steps to simplify it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
We're having some IT problems. Senator Grassley, are you out there? All right. Then we will go next to Senator Brown, and then Senator Cassidy, Senator Brown. Senator Cassidy.
Great, thank you. Professor Brown, a couple things. I want to make sure that Democrats speak to, hopefully my Democratic colleagues will speak to some of the Republican witnesses, but I want to speak to some of the Democratic. My Democratic Senate colleague have made repeal of the SALT tax provision kind of like as one set of red line. But it sounds like you would disagree with their advocacy for this, since as Mr. Hawkins pointed out, by the way, great to see you, Mr. Hawkins. We used to sit next to each other. As Mr. Hawkins points out, the benefit of that accrues to the extremely wealthy, principally, and those folks typically are not African American. So would you disagree with my Senate colleagues as regards the wisdom of repealing the SALT tax?
Yes, and I'd say you have perhaps read my testimony closely. That's exactly what I would do. And here's the thing, right now we've got about 10.
Hang on, I just got 5 minutes, I gotta go. I just wanted to get that for the record, thank you. Miss Rao, and I'm just curious, I'm not challenging, but your testimony suggests that the inability of women and others to raise money, people of color. I noticed that Ms. Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. I think I see that she's raised $815 million in political contributions since 2002. That's a lot of money. Could you have a sense of why she can raise so much money, and yet your testimony is along the lines of it's difficult for someone like you to raise money? It doesn't seem as if there's been a barrier, if you will, as for her. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. Thank you so much, Senator. I think one of the fundamental differences is that for people of color and women, they need to reach a certain level of notoriety or of a certain level in which they are seen as someone who's credible before they can reach that access to capital. Whereas founders that are white don't have to reach that same threshold of credibility before they're able to access. So to your exact point, I think that it has been easy for some individuals, some women, to be able to raise capital, but for the vast majority of women, for myself as a woman of color who's raising a venture capital fund, who doesn't come from generational wealth, it's been extremely difficult because
now, let me ask, if someone graduated now and she's 24 years old and she graduates, or 26 and she graduates from Harvard Law or has a Harvard MBA or a Stanford MBA, do you feel as if that would be the ticket, the contacts that she would need to have, et cetera, that would allow her to raise more successfully?
I think that there are certainly intersectionalities between race and education and socioeconomic status, as I pointed out in the testimony, that allow and enable some women and some people of color to advance further and maybe quicker. But my point in that is that maybe we need better representation of different types of diversity. And
I get that. I accept that. Believe me. But it does seem as if you subtracted out the role of gender and race and you inserted, say, a Barack Obama graduating from an Ivy League school, that maybe you would have the range of contacts that others would have. I have to move on. I apologize. Professor, one more time. And by the way, Desai and Hawkins, I loved your testimony. Oh, my gosh, I'm going to pin it on my bulletin board. So much so that that's why I'm talking to the others. Professor, one, I agree with you about the step-up basis. I once wondered, why did the Kennedy family continue to have so much wealth when I don't see any of them kind of doing the same entrepreneurship that Joe Kennedy did way back when, loosely defining entrepreneurship. And then I realized it is that stepped up basis for the inheritance in their foundation. So again, we have a point of agreement there as well. But let me ask you something that Dr. Desai mentioned, alluded to, and I may not get this right, Dr. Desai, if so, I apologize. You focus on the privileges, if you will, of folks who have more income in the tax code. But Dr. Desai, whether he said this or not, this is how I drew from it based on my own experience, pointed out that many other programs have an inverse effect. I'm a doctor. I worked in Louisiana's charity hospital system for the uninsured, the poor, and the majority of my patients, 80%, were African American. They were on Medicaid. More were on TANF. More were in public school, supported by tax dollars, as opposed to non-African American children who were tending to pay for their own education in parochial or private. In your analysis, do you look at the mirror image where there is a heck of a lot of benefits that accrue to those of color or those who are less well off disproportionately, not because it's necessarily designed that way, but inherent in the addressing an issue such as healthcare for the uninsured? You're going to capture more of those folks who are, again, less well off, no matter what their color, but disproportionately they are of color.
I'm not sure I'm tracking the question. That was a long
so if
question.
you look at it, African Americans are more likely to be on Medicaid, more likely to receive EITC, not in absolute numbers, but as a percent of their total population. And so that is a benefit which accrues to those who are of color, which is financed, if you will, by those who would not be of color. Does your analysis look at that?
So I would say so my response would be, when we think about white Americans who may pay less in taxes, but are overly reliant on a court system. So I do think there's a connection between taxes and services, but I think at the basis would be the information. And
let me stop this, because that's off point. And I'll finish with this, Mr. Chairman, that if we're going to say that the benefits of the exemptions benefit those who make more money and they just happen to be white, then it's probably fair to say that the benefits of these social safety net programs accrue to those of color. Frankly, not because they are of color, but because they meet the need otherwise. But that does seem to be the mirror image. It does seem to be something which your research appears to ignore. And whether Dr. Desai meant that when he alluded, I don't know, but that's how I took it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The time of my colleagues expired. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it. Mr. Hawkins, it's good to see you in Ohio and before this committee. I appreciated our work on civil asset forfeiture together when you were working in the Senate with my friend, Senator Tim Scott. So thank you for that. Professor Brown, my questions are mostly for you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for calling attention to the intersection of racial equity and tax policy. You've done that, I think, better perhaps than anybody in the country, far more connected than most people think. I'm glad we're having this hearing to examine that. Not only do we need a tax code, as you say, that is far more equitable, we need an IRS that administers and enforces that tax code fairly. When the IRS commissioner was before this committee, Chairman Wyden, just a week ago, or actually when he was here the first time last summer, I asked him if he could assure us that IRS audit rates do not disproportionately affect Black and brown tax filers. He said yes, he can assure us that audit rates don't have a disproportionate impact. But given that IRS doesn't collect race data and that the Census Bureau doesn't generally share data with IRS, I question whether the IRS really knows the extent to which its enforcement activities have a racially disparate impact. So my question is this, Ms. Brown, what are your thoughts on this? What would responsible IRS guardrails be to prevent disproportionate impacts? What would they look like to you?
Well, they would look different than what we see, right? So we saw, or ProPublica published research that shows the significant percentages of Black EITC claimants in the South that are being audited. So we would want to collect data on who is being audited so that we could compare them to the tax-paying population to see if there were any differences. It all goes back to data. That's really important. And notwithstanding what I heard, we don't have the data.
And you have ways you can, to this committee, suggest that IRS adjust their practices?
Do I have ways? Well, yes, it would be not overly auditing low-income taxpayers and auditing high-income taxpayers. That would be one place to start.
Let me thank you. I don't mean to interrupt, but I guess I do mean to interrupt, but I apologize. Let me build on that. One of the most important parts of the American Rescue Plan that Congress passed in March, which I remember after voting that day, sitting next to my friend Senator Casey on the Senate floor, saying this was the best professional day of my life because of what we did with child tax credit, earned income tax credit, and all the things that Senator Casey did with children. But we expanded, as you know, unlike the enormous giveaways included in the 2017 tax law, overwhelmingly we went to wealthy and white tax filers. EITC and the CT helped low-income whites and blacks and brown tax filers, Asian tax filers, everybody. For example, the expansion of the CTC is estimated to cut Black poverty, you know this, by more than 50%, Hispanic poverty by almost that much. The same holds true for EITC in Ohio. 50,000 workers of color under 25 who can't get any EITC under current law will benefit from this expansion. So we talk much about CTC. We also, as the chairman does, talks about CTC. So should Congress, my question is this, and I think I know the answer, but it's how we do things. Should Congress make the child tax credit EITC permanent?
Yes.
Okay, I figured you would. Last thing, I want to ask the panel about the tax gap, just a yes or no on this one. We know $400 billion is legally owed to the IRS each year, but not collected. The tax avoidance robs our nation of much needed revenue, as undermines trust in government. Who benefits the most from adequate enforcement of our tax law? Who stands to lose the most from the revenue we lose? If we just really quickly have 1 minute left, give me a very concise answer, starting again with you, Ms. Brown, if you would.
So I would say the wealthy white taxpayers who are currently not being audited stand to gain the most from a dysfunctional system that we have now that targets disproportionately Black EITC claimants.
Mr. Desai.
I think more enforcement resources for the IRS is a terrific agenda. I don't think it's entirely clear where that gap is and who would end up funding it. But I think greater enforcement dollars is a wonderful agenda.
Mr. Hawkins.
Greater enforcement dollars is absolutely a wonderful agenda, and it's something that would make sense and make our tax code more fair.
Ms. Rao.
This is I'm not a tax expert, but certainly greater incentives for participation in as an investor certainly would increase the representation that's seen in venture capital.
Thank you all for your conciseness. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Now, in order of appearance, Senator Bennett, Senator Lankford, and Senator Casey. I don't see Senator Bennett, so that would mean our next two would be Senator Lankford and then Senator Casey. Senator Lankford.
Chairman, thank you. To all of our witnesses, thank you very much for your work and your testimony and for bringing all these different ideas for our conversation today. Mr. Hawkins, I want to ask you a little bit about opportunity zones as well. You spoke about and wrote about democratizing opportunity zone investment. Can you go into a little deeper in that for me?
Sure. And so opportunity zones basically have 3 levels of possible benefit. If once you have a capital gain and you reinvest that capital gain in an opportunity zone, first you get a 10-year, up to 10-year deferral of that capital gains tax liability. Second, if you invest for longer periods of time, 5 or 7 years, then you get what's called a step up in basis, or a little bit off that tax bill. You're still going to owe, but you get a little bit off that tax bill. And the last benefit refers to the investment in the zone. So if I invest in, let's say, a Shay Hawkins version of Facebook or something like that, what it says is if I hold that investment for more than 10 years, then I get a 100% step up in basis or no capital gains tax liability when I sell that company in 15 or 20 years. So what we can do is for the purposes of that 100% step up in basis, for holding that company for 10, 11, 15, 20 years, we can allow non-capital gains to be invested for that purpose and get the benefit of that 100% step up in basis. And so what it would do, if there's 10,000 people in a community who want to come together and give $100 to make a $1 million investment to pool their money, people who wouldn't have capital gains normally can then participate in opportunity zones and benefit in one additional way, not just with increased property values, not with just increased access to goods and services, not with just increased jobs that come with opportunity zones, but also they can participate as investors.
Okay, that's helpful as well. I've worked extensively on trying to be able to get access to retirement money for an emergency fund without a tax penalty in the process. This is something I've worked on quite a bit. Continue to be able to work on a good proposal. I want to incentivize more people to be able to save for retirement, but I also want to reduce the penalty that people pay if they have to pull that out. If your refrigerator goes out, or your car has damage, or whatever it may be, very few people have an emergency fund. And so they never save for retirement because they think they can't get access to it in case of an emergency, but to be able to give some access to that. There's been some debate on how big that is because you want to incentivize people to save for retirement. It can't be just an emergency fund that you're pulling from because you're trying to incentivize for retirement savings as well to be able to help people. But you've got to also get access to those dollars so that people don't pay a 10% tax penalty if they have to get to it. The question I would have for you, what would you suggest is the dollar amount that would need to be there that people could get access to for an emergency fund and still incentivize them saving for retirement? How big should that dollar amount be that they're allowed to get to for their emergency fund out of their 401k?
You know, it's going to vary for different families, but I mean, I think it would need to be set. Certainly, when you're looking at thousands of dollars. I would imagine that in the $3,000 to $5,000 range would be a threshold that would make sense for most families because I mean if you're looking at it could be a basement flooding or any other type of emergency that you can think of, and when you look at how low the saving rates for the people in the lower 50% of the American income scale, when you look at how low those rates are, with an average retirement savings in that group of zero, they're going to be reluctant, as you said, to set that money aside if they know they can't get their hands on it in the case of a temporary emergency.
Does anyone else have an opinion about what that dollar amount should be, both to incentivize retirement and then to also allow people to get access to some of that money for an emergency? Does anyone have a dollar amount that you would prefer? I'm going to take that as a no then from our panel. Panel, thank you very much for contributing on this. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to give you 18 seconds back.
Thank you for your thoughtfulness, Senator Langford. Senator Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for this hearing. I'm going to direct my questions to Professor Brown. I hope she doesn't mind that I'll have all my questions for her, but we're grateful for her scholarship and grateful for the new book that she has and the work that's being done on the issues we're talking about today. I wanted to start with maybe at least two questions about data and then also a question about childcare. Professor Brown, your significant research regarding identifying these racial disparities in the tax code is critically important. Can you discuss the types of data you wish the IRS collected that would help with this research and how you worked around the limitations by not having that data collected?
I would like to see the statistics of income data talked about by race. What percentage of taxpayers have this exclusion? What percentage of taxpayers benefit from that deduction? So I would basically like all the 1040 information for individuals deraced, as it were, to tell us what percentage take advantage of which tax breaks. And what I had to do was look at other data sets. So there was a question earlier that talked about the racially, what percentage of Medicaid recipients were Black. Well, why do we know that? Because some government agency publishes it. The IRS needs to publish tax data as well. So I worked around it by looking at different disciplines and getting proxies. Census Bureau is a proxy for tax return data.
Yeah, and it's like anything else. I don't know who said this, but the old expression, what gets measured gets managed. We can't do much, obviously, without data. And any any changes with respect to tax data will, of course, take some time. Just want to ask you this question about data. In your view, is it possible for Treasury and IRS to undertake gender and racial impact analysis by adding or inputting statistical data?
So first of all, the IRS has published gender and age studies already. So they've done the work with respect to gender. I certainly think there is the capacity, not capacity in terms of, we know the people who can do it, but the agency should be able, Treasury, IRS should be able to get this done.
And do you think that could be included, that statistical data could be included with a reasonable degree of certainty as part of the policy analysis?
I do. I absolutely do.
I wanted to ask you as well about childcare. We know how critical it is, not only in the midst of a pandemic, but childcare is essential to our national economic infrastructure. It's especially critical now for working families. We've made tremendous progress in ensuring that all families that are eligible can benefit from the child and dependent care tax credit through the rescue plan. As Senator Brown mentioned, the great advancement in expanding the child tax credit that he worked so hard on with the chairman and others, but also the great expansion of the child and dependent care tax credit, which so many of us have been pushing for years. This credit is now fully refundable, and parents can get up to half of the cost of childcare. According to the National Academies of Science, these improvements, making the tax credits fully refundable, both in the child credit as well as the child and dependent care credit, can reduce child poverty tremendously by half or more if you include both of them. And that increases earnings and employment. And I think especially and disproportionately will help African-American families. In your view, what are some of the most important investments that we can make through harnessing the tax code to support economic security?
So when I think about, well, first I would say tax income from capital at the same rate as income from wages. So there's no reason to prefer capital to labor. So the tax break, or put a different way, why should workers not have the choice to pay the low preferential rate because they earn income as opposed to their money works for them? So that's one of my big picture suggestions.
Thanks very much, Professor. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank my colleague. Next will be Senator Daines.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to join my colleagues in highlighting some of the changes we made to the tax code in 17 that helped address inequality and disparities. In fact, we lowered rates across the board, doubled standard deduction, doubled the child tax credit, capped the SALT deduction, capped the mortgage interest deduction, and much more. And we know these policies worked because we saw those results in that pre-pandemic economy. In fact, if you're looking past 2017 into just before we hit the pandemic, we saw record low unemployment rates for African-American workers, for Hispanic workers. Labor force participation was growing. Poverty rate hit an all-time low. Incomes were growing for all workers, but they were growing faster for workers at the bottom of the income scale. And to return to that robust economy, we do not need to increase tax across the board. We need to build on the gains that we made with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Turning to my questions, I've always been concerned with how the tax code looks for Main Street businesses. And that's why that 20% deduction we had for pass-throughs, like sole proprietorships, partnerships, LLCs, was such a critical part of the tax reform. And that's why I introduced that Main Street Tax Certainty Act with Senators Cassidy, Scott, and Portman to make that Section 199A, that 20% tax deduction for the pass-through businesses, permanent. Identical legislation was introduced in the House on a bipartisan basis. My questions for Mr. Hawkins. You mentioned in your testimony that minority-owned businesses are more likely to be organized as a pass-through entity versus a C Corp. Is it safe to say that making the 199A 20% tax deduction permanent will help minority entrepreneurs and help grow our economy?
Absolutely, Senator. When you look at the structure of most minority small businesses, they're going to be sole proprietorships, typically partnerships or LLCs. And so the legislation that you introduced to make that 20% deduction permanent will have a strong targeted effect on benefiting minority small business owners. One good example that I'm very proud of in my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, there's a minority and veteran-owned small business, Bridgeport Group. They take advantage of that 20% deduction, and they're also, using opportunity zones to expand their supply chain logistics business to serve Cleveland's world-class healthcare market. And so, I come in contact with minority business owners who have a direct benefit from that deduction, and I'm excited to see the bipartisan support that we saw, with the introduction on the House side. And
so Mr. Hawkins, let me follow this. That Cleveland example is a great example.
Yeah.
So is it safe to say then that if that it would help minority entrepreneurs if we made the deduction permanent? Would it also hurt them if it were to be scaled back or eliminated, as the Biden administration and certain members on the other side of the aisle have proposed?
Absolutely. Like I said, the president of the Bridgeport Group, Andre Bryant, is an example of someone who would be harmed if we roll it back.
Thank you. Professor Brown, several of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle think that Congress should eliminate the $10,000 cap on the state and local tax deduction that was put in place by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Given that 96% of the benefits from eliminating the SALT cap would go to the top quintile, with 57% going to the top 1%, do you agree that eliminating the cap on this deduction would be bad policy?
I believe all itemized deductions should go, including the state and local tax. So I believe the mortgage interest deduction should go. I believe state and local taxes should go.
So you would support eliminating that, the provision made there on SALT that would actually go 57% going to the top 1% would receive that?
No. I don't want any taxpayer to be allowed to itemize deductions, since only 10% of Americans do it. So I think you and I are saying the same thing in the sense
okay, so you want to eliminate all deductions. Okay, you'd keep the SALT, limit SALT. Okay, got it. On marginal tax rates, there's a long history of bipartisan interest removing. I'm out of time here, so I'm gonna, out of respect for the chairman managing the hearing here, I'll end there. So thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Dane. Senator Grassley is next, followed by Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Senator, Mr. Chairman. And I have a question to start out with Professor Brown. I appreciate your candor that you had with Senator Cassidy on your opposition to eliminating the $10,000 SALT deduction cap. It's clear that repealing that cap would overwhelmingly benefit wealthy. In fact, according to the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, over half of the benefit from repeal would go to taxpayers with income exceeding $1 million. So the question is kind of like this. Would you have similar concerns that you expressed to Senator Cassidy about SALT, about tax subsidies for high-end car ownership? I'll give you an example, $7,500 federal tax credit for the purchase of expensive electric vehicles, giving that such a subsidy would benefit the wealthy, while Americans who often drive such cars as a status symbol.
So I haven't studied it, but my gut says I would not support that.
Well, thank you for that. The tax for Mr. Hawkins, The Tax Cut and Job Act provides significant tax benefit to low to moderate income families. It also focused pro-growth policies, leading to increased investment and higher productivity, rising wages. There is ample evidence that prior to the pandemic, it was working. Best economy in 50 years. In fact, wage growth was strongest for low-income, low-wage workers. As a result, the Federal Reserve survey of consumer finance's income inequality declined between 2016 and 2019. Lower income Americans also saw similar gains in wealth as they did in income. Moreover, Black and Hispanic families experienced some of the largest wealth gains. Median net worth rose 33% for Black families, 65% for Hispanic families, compared with 3% gain for white families. Mr. Hawkins, do you agree pro-growth tax policies are essential if our goal is to improve the well-being of low-income Americans and reduce economic disparities?
Absolutely, Senator Grassley. You know, when you're looking at what happened following the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, what you saw was a bill that ignited the economy. And as that economy heated up, those labor markets tightened. And as the labor markets tightened, you saw rising wages on the lower end of the income scale. And again, as you mentioned, you know, record unemployment for the Black community, record unemployment for the Hispanic, Asian community, record unemployment for women. And so that's really the key, is to ignite the economy, tighten the labor market, and get wages rising.
I don't know whether I'm running out of time, but this is my last question. This is for President or Professor Desai. The tax code includes several tax benefits targeted at low-income households. This includes refundable credits such as the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. But according to the Congressional Budget Office, low and moderate income workers can experience exceedingly high marginal effective tax rates as the benefits phase out regardless of their positive purpose. These marginal effective rates can exceed the top statutory tax rate of 37% and in some cases exceed 100%. So to you, Professor, how would you expect these high marginal tax rates to affect low-income individuals who may be considering working more hours or increasing their earning potential through education?
Yes, exactly, Senator Grassley. You're right that the phase outs associated with some of those credits do become manifest in higher marginal tax rates as individuals move up the income spectrum. And that is a problem. Having said that, it is also the case that they are a natural part of any phase out. And in fact, any effort to use credits in ways that I think they should be used will feature this. So to ameliorate it, one would want to think a little bit about using maybe demogrants a little bit more and also making the phase out a little less steep, both of which could remedy the problems associated with higher marginal tax rates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Cantwell is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this important hearing and to all the witnesses. I want to look at the question a little differently on the issue, just access to capital. Last year, startups raised 13% more from venture capitalists than they did the previous year. So that the total was $150 billion. And yet we know that the share of money going to women and minority businesses is just a pittance. We know that 2.2% of all venture capital raised in 2020 went to women-funded companies, and just 1% went to investments in tech startups going to Black entrepreneurs. So we know this is a problem, and we know we need to do something about it. In Washington, we see this disparity with just 35% of all small businesses are owned by women, and just 3% are Black owned, according to a recent analysis in our area. But the question becomes a priority of, I know the Black Founders Matter is trying to take this issue head on. This is an organization that is trying to support entrepreneurship out of Black-owned businesses. So what, I think Ms. Potlapali, what do we need to do for venture capital to play a bigger role in building wealth in these communities and diversity? And what has been your experience in trying to raise venture capital funds?
Thank you so much, Senator. So first off, I really want to reiterate what you just said, which is that there's an extreme disparity when it comes to founders being able to raise capital. I think that we can all point to outliers of people that are well-known, nationally recognized, like Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama, or even Beyonce, who could, start a company and raise money within minutes. But that is not the, the experience that average people of color or women receive when they are going and starting out. A perfect example of that actually is Jewel Burke, who had an amazing acquisition by Amazon. We interviewed her and she said that in her first raise, she went for over a year trying to raise that capital. And it was a successful acquisition in the end. But as you can see, there are different barriers that women of color, women, and in general, BIPOC founders have to face when they are doing pitches in front of investors. And that's because there is a lack of representation and there's absolutely a homogeneous groupthink process. So in order for venture capital to be able to actively participate in creating a more equitable society, there are a couple things that need to happen. One is the re-education of investors in understanding how to evaluate different subsets of founders. I think that educational piece is critical to being able to promote equity. The second piece is inclusion of tax incentives as well as other programs and scholarships to be able to allow different types of people to be at the decision-making table, because we all have our own implicit biases and we can course correct that with education, as well as understanding how to invest in different types of companies, right? Like the traditional venture capitalist is investing in B2B SaaS, but how do we invest in other types of businesses that maybe minority and women-owned businesses have a more propensity towards venturing into? And so how can we adequately be able to invest in different types of businesses is one, but two, having different types of people that represent different lived experiences at the decision-making table is fundamentally one of the best ways to be able to create equity in this space. That's something that Professor Brown mentioned, is we don't have the same level of access to education and resources. And even when we do, we don't have the same level of decision-making power and are impacted in different ways.
Well, I see my time is almost expired, so I would love it if you could send me some recommendations as it relates to tax policy incentives that you think would help in this particular area. But Mr. Chairman, such an important time period for this discussion, because we know even from the SBA that people were getting let out. Basically, we're not getting the same access to capital from our traditional sources. So these private sector sources also are a problem. So I hope we can look at incentives. Thank you very much.
Very important, Senator Cantwell. Next in order of appearance, it would be Senator Jones and Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, and thank you for having this hearing, and I want to thank all our panelists for being here today. If I might just start by pointing out that some of the progress that we've made since passage of the 2017 tax law, I think illustrates that if you provide incentives, the right incentives, people invest, you get growth in the economy, you get better paying jobs and higher wages, which is exactly what's happened. And, a number of the changes that we made in the tax code in the 2017 Act were very progressive. We lowered tax rates, expanded tax brackets, doubled the standard deduction, expanded the child tax credit. And if you look at the results of what's happened since, we've had the lowest overall unemployment rate in more than 50 years. This is pre-pandemic, February of 2020, 3.5%. Record low unemployment rates for Blacks or African-American workers and for Hispanic workers, and robust job growth. And in fact, if you look at where a lot of the income growth has occurred, it has benefited the most lower income workers. In fact, some pretty remarkable statistics. The income growth in 2019 was the most broad-based and best ever recorded in a single year. And the poverty rate fell the most in half a century. So in terms of what we're doing, I don't think we ought to be radically changing. In fact, I think that what we were doing was working pretty well. And that's why I think this, as we talk about these issues at a hearing like this and trying to figure out how we address income inequality, I think we need to remember that the best way to do that is to get growth in the economy. When the economy is expanding and growing, it's creating those better paying jobs and raising wages for American workers. So let me just, if I might, ask Mr. Hawkins and Professor Desai, can you discuss how the economic growth from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expanded opportunities for America's lowest income workers, and to best protect these gains, are there particular tax proposals that you think would be counterproductive to low income workers?
So, Senator, the gains from Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the lower income states come in 3 points. One is in higher employment among folks on the lowest levels. And so, second, you're going to see higher wages amongst folks on the lowest levels. And third, you're going to see lower poverty amongst folks on the lowest income levels. And so, those kind of 3 things coming together, really spoke to a lot of what you guys set out to accomplish with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so, in terms of counterproductive measures, obviously, raising the corporate rate, will be counterproductive because corporations don't pay taxes. They just pass those taxes on to workers in the form of fewer job opportunities, on to shareholders, and then finally on to consumers. So raising the corporate rate will be counterproductive. Eliminating the 20% deduction for pass-through entities, again, will be particularly damaging to minority business owners, small business owners, because a disproportionate amount of their businesses are going to be pass-throughs as opposed to corporations, sole proprietorships, LLCs, and partnerships.
I would just add a couple things to that commentary by Mr. Hawkins. First, I think if one is interested in the bottom quintiles of the population, then the most direct ways to assist them include expanding the earned income tax credit, a childless earned income tax credit. Some of the ideas that I bounced around in my written testimony. I think, to reiterate what Mr. Hawkins said, I think it would be useful to be careful about heavily raising taxes on corporations, and in particular on their global activities. I think the notion that somehow there is a lot of revenue to be gained, easy money to be gained by changing corporate rates, I think is not well-founded. And moreover, it won't redound to the benefit of American workers, because we know that when American corporations succeed around the world, they succeed at home. So I think we need to kind of get away from the idea that somehow corporations are ones who are not necessarily paying their fair share. I think that whole way of thinking about the world, as Mr. Hawkins alluded to, doesn't actually reflect the fact that more than half of the corporate tax is borne by workers rather than capital.
Retirement plans, and so we'll put her on the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Thune. We've had senators going back and forth. At this time, let's have Senator Whitehouse and then Senator Bennett. Is that acceptable to you, Senator Bennett?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator Whitehouse, then Senator Bennett. Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Chairman. I appreciate this hearing, and I just wanted to flag the problem of tax spending. Couple of things about it. First, it is big. The IRS collects about $3.5 trillion in income and payroll taxes each year. And Joint Committee on Taxation using CRS numbers, actually, sorry, vice versa, CRS using JCT numbers,
estimates that tax expenditures for 2021 would cost 1.53 trillion. So there's a lot of money going out the back door of the tax code. It is big. It's also lasting. If you come in and get an appropriation, once the appropriation is spent down, you're all done, and you've got to come back and get another. But if you can bake something into the tax code, it's there for you and for your interests forever. So it's big and it's lasting. It also, I believe, tends to be regressive. As Professor Brown has pointed out, tax expenditures tend to disproportionately benefit the very wealthy, allowing those that have access to high-priced tax attorneys to choose if and when they pay taxes. And of course, you have to be making a lot of money to make it worth your while to spend money on tax savings. In that regard, Ms. Brown, I wonder if you could offer a brief comment on the extent to which opportunity zones run counter to that tax spending problem of being big, lasting, and regressive, or whether they masqueraded yet another tax giveaway to wealthy investors.
So I think opportunity zones do make a giveaway to wealthy white investors under the guise of helping distressed communities. And I think you can find an anecdote or two will say, well, it worked here, but there are other anecdotes that show wealthy investors have influenced which areas were even named as opportunity zones and not necessarily with distressed communities, the way the statute perhaps should have been written if they were actually interested in holding people's feet to the fire. So I think there's a lot of leeway in opportunity zones that make it not as helpful to distressed communities.
Thank you. So again, back to tax spending. It's big, it's lasting, it's regressive. Opportunity zones probably didn't help. And some of it is foreign. As for how you support small businesses, the Ugland House is a small 5-story building in the Cayman Islands that is home to well over 18,000 corporate, quote, headquarters. And nearly half of them were determined by the GAO to have US billing addresses. So when you're talking about small business, you've got 9,000 of them in one little building. That's not exactly, Ms. Rao, what you have in mind when you're thinking of helping small businesses get started, is it?
No, thank you so much, Senator. So while I know that that exists, actually the founders that I work with in early stage, especially primarily BIPOC founders, are not necessarily those who have access to capital. And certainly, as you pointed out, it takes a lot of money to pay those high-priced lawyers. Actually, the capital that's used by these BIPOC founders is used in this talent acquisition race. So a lot of issues that founders have in their development of their venture is this idea that they can't access great talent. And so they are utilizing the capital that they receive to be able to work on their business and to actually scale and grow and to be able to create that differentiation moat.
So last question, what income demographic do you think it is that is taking advantage of Ugland House and other offshore refuges to avoid paying taxes?
I would surmise that it would likely be those, as Professor Brown suggests, that are already benefiting from the tax codes as they're written.
Stands to reason. I yield back my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. And thank you to the witnesses. I'm very, very grateful that all of you are here today. An important topic because the United States has one of the lowest rates of economic mobility and highest rates of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. And childhood poverty is disproportionately experienced by children of color. In 2019, Black and Hispanic children were about 3 times as likely to be living in poverty as white children. Professor Brown, as superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, I witnessed firsthand the effects growing up poor can have on a child's development and opportunity for success later in life. For those reasons, I wrote the American Family Act along with my colleague, Senator Sherrod Brown, and have been pushing to expand the child tax credit and make it fully refundable for many years. And I'm very pleased that we just passed this expansion as part of the American Rescue Plan. It will cut childhood poverty in this country by almost half this year. 90% of children will benefit from the expanded CTC, but it will have disproportionately large effects on children of color, reducing poverty for Black children by more than 50%, for Hispanic children by nearly the same, and for Native American children by more than 60%. Professor Brown, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the importance of the expanded child tax credit and how this part of the American Rescue Plan will make our tax code more equitable for families of color.
That was a sea change. Being able to have low-income families get fully funded child tax credits was a significant advancement in the legislature. And I can just, because I've written about this, I can just think about the decades where that wasn't true. So it was, so when we talk about statistics about single families and poverty, part of why that existed was because before now, Congress had not allowed earned income tax credit families to fully get the benefit of the child tax credit for each of their children.
And I assume that you think it would be helpful if we could find a way to make this permanent.
You are correct. Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Mr. Desai, or Dr. Desai, the American Rescue Plan also temporarily tripled the earned income tax credit, which you've been talking about today, for low-paid workers without dependent children in their home. This change will boost incomes for an estimated 17 million workers who disproportionately come from communities of color and are in the early years of their careers. How will the EITC expansion promote racial equity and financial opportunity for young workers? And do you believe that making this one-year EITC expansion permanent would help our tax code better promote racial equity for workers?
Thanks, Senator Bennett. Yes, I think the expansion of the EITC was a wonderful move. I think we could do more. I think we could make it bigger. I think we could expand it to the childless. And I think we could make it permanent. And I think that is the way forward on this general agenda. I think in particular, as I laid out in my testimony, thinking about the exclusion of capital gains on primary residences or retirement buildup, I don't think is as effective as being laser focused. And I think this is precisely why this hearing is so important, because it might reorient our attention towards these kinds of questions. Like the child credit, those are where we have the potential for the greatest gains for the bottom quintiles.
I really appreciate that testimony. Mr. Chairman, I have no idea whether I'm out of time or not.
My colleague has a minute left.
Okay, I have one last question, which data from the Small Business Association indicates that people of color are significantly less likely to own a business than white individuals in the U.S. Among those who do, more than 90% of all Black and Hispanic-owned businesses are owner-only firms. And owner-only firms tend to have significantly smaller profits than larger firms with multiple employees on payroll. U.S. tax code should provide a level playing field for small minority-owned businesses, which already face greater challenges securing capital in white-owned businesses. Yet, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, the design of the pass-through deduction in the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act means the smallest businesses will receive the smallest benefits. Professor Brown, do you believe the pass-through deduction in the 2017 tax law was well designed to help small minority-owned businesses succeed compared to their larger, often white-owned competitors?
No, I do not.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank my colleague, Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So nearly every component of tax law has a racial equity impact, but it's not just about what tax laws are on the books. It's also about how they're enforced. So last week, the IRS commissioner told this committee that the tax gap, the amount of taxes owed but not paid, could exceed $1 trillion every year. The top 1% of Americans account for more than a third and potentially as much as 70% of the taxes owed but not paid. But the IRS's efforts to enforce our tax laws, including the audits conducted to check whether or not a taxpayer is following the law, don't focus on these wealthy taxpayers. In 2019, low-income families claiming the Earned Income Tax Credit made up nearly 40% of all IRS audits. So, Ms. Brown, we audit a lot of lower income taxpayers rather than focusing on the wealthiest people. What does that mean for the racial impact of our tax enforcement strategy?
It means that it's being borne on the on the backs of Black Americans, and not where the true gap is with higher income white Americans who have access to tax attorneys who apparently the IRS would prefer not to push back against. So they go after low income EITC claimants who don't have access to tax attorneys to push back. It's very unfair.
That's right. And Professor Brown, am I right that you have looked at what the most audited counties in America are?
Well, ProPublica did research on that, and of course, I'm familiar with that. Yes, and they are in rural Black communities in the South, and in the South is disproportionately the number of Black Americans living in the South. So they have been Black Americans in the South who filed the EITC have been targeted when research shows over 50% of EITC claimants are white.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Professor Brown. You know, as your research shows, one reason why is implicit bias. Politicians and bureaucrats embracing harmful stereotypes about Black Americans that can lead them to single out EITC recipients. But there's another piece here too. After years of Republican budget cuts, the IRS targets the people who are the cheapest to audit, and that's low-income taxpayers, many of them people of color. It is cheap and easy for the IRS to blast out letters to intimidate EITC recipients, but rich people use complicated tricks to evade taxes, so those investigations require time and money and expertise, things that the IRS is short on. In fact, a recent report from the Treasury Inspector General found that the IRS is not even working on the cases of the highest income taxpayers who don't file taxes at all, but who collectively owe more than $45 billion. So, Professor Brown, if we gave the IRS a big pot of money and mandated that the IRS spend it on auditing the wealthiest taxpayers and the biggest corporations, targets where we know there's a huge amount of money going uncollected, could that help reduce the racial disparities in the tax system?
Absolutely, absolutely. It would make who pays taxes a lot fairer.
Good. So thank you. You know, there's a lot we need to do to make our tax system less racist. And one easy place to start is by making sure that the IRS has the resources and clear direction to go after the biggest tax cheats. I'm really glad that Commissioner Reddick supports the bill that I'm working on to provide a new targeted mandatory funding stream for the IRS so that the agency has a predictable, sustained, and protected pot of funds dedicated to ensuring that the wealthy and that big corporations are paying their fair share. It would give us a better, stronger, and more equitable tax system for all Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. Are there any other senators who'd like to ask any questions? Okay, hearing none, let me just check. Are we sure that there are no other senators that have questions? Okay. Let me close by saying that today's hearing is the first hearing of the Senate Finance Committee to look at racial, ethnic, and gender disparities under the tax code in decades, if not the first ever hearing on this critically important issue. And it seems to me some important ideas are reflective of witnesses of differing views coming together. For example, after this massive cut in tax enforcement in the last decade. I heard witness after witness saying you have to beef it up. And one of the reasons that I asked the IRS commissioner last week about the tax gap is that I knew that it was far bigger than what was actually a matter of official record. And I knew that the central problem was that too many cheats were getting away with it without any consequences when they chose to ignore the law. So I'm going to close by touching on a point that Professor Brown made hours ago when she said you have to be a detective to find more data about these critical issues that we've been talking about. So I believe it is long past time to make it easier to obtain the key tax data that will illuminate the injustices in our tax law. I believe this can be done in a manner that protects the confidentiality and privacy of all taxpayers. And I am going to be asking senators on this committee to work with me to implement this long overdue and essential transparency reform. With that, I want to thank all our witnesses again. Ms. Rao, you reflected very well on our state this morning. And with that, the Senate Finance Committee is adjourned.